Hi, hello, and welcome to Shankar IAS Academy's daily current affairs analysis. Today's date is 21/2026, and with this, again, we have a pre-storming test series which is coming across. The batch 5 starts on 20th Jan 2026. We have across 46 integrated tests that would help us aid in your preparation. Please call the number that is given below to register yourself with this test series. And with this, we move to the topics of discussion for the day. The first is about terror birds and how it became extinct and what the reason was. And we have touched upon this in detail. The second is about the marine mammals and the irreversible evolution and about Dollo's law. The third is about India's architectural heritage, and we have touched upon a few of the interesting monuments and important monuments, the UPSC perspective. The fourth is about Shishupal Garh, how it was the capital of Kalinga and why it is forgotten. And the fifth is about the prelims focused for the day. So the first topic of the day is about something called as the terror birds, and this article was taken from the Forbes magazine. And a biologist explains how the prehistoric terror birds earn their name and why these birds are called as terror birds, what are these terror birds and what are the phenomenon that they've undergone, how did they become extinct. We're going to see all those factors here. And we're moving on to the first slide. We're going to see what terror birds are. Terror birds are scientifically known as Phorusacids, and they were a family of large flightless carnivorous birds. They acted as apex predators. See, these birds, they cannot fly. That is the first point. They are carnivorous birds and they cannot fly. First point. Apex predators, meaning top predators in South America for nearly 60 million years, and after that they became extinct following the extinction of dinosaurs. After dinosaurs, they became extinct. Here you have to understand that all dinosaurs are birds, but not all birds are dinosaurs. So dinosaurs are birds, yes. Next is the physical characteristics and habitat. It ranged from small agile runners to giants over 2 meters, that is 6'7" tall. And the anatomy is that they have long legs, they have wings, and their heads are so large, it's very disproportionate to their body. You see, some people will be very petite, but their head is so big. It is such an appearance, and they have deep hooked beaks. The beaks are typically in this fashion. It's deep hooked beaks and large heads. They thrived in savannas and grasslands of South America during the Cenozoic era. And see, their bone structure is that when you see the bone structure, you see that they were active. They're very fast runners. They run very fast, and henceforth, the bone structure shows that they're very active and that wide-ranging animals that grew quickly to meet the ecological pressures. So, the biological hatchet, the hunting strategy. So these birds, they dominated the ecosystem. They are very, very significant. And how did this happen, and why did their hunting style have something very, very significant? The first one is the strike and retreat style. Say they did not wrestle prey. Each bird or each species in the world has a different way of attacking and taking its prey and having food. This has a strike and retreat style. See, that is, they have a blowing technique. They have their beaks, which are very, very strong. So they attack either the head or the neck, and they attack in very fast motions like this, so that either your neck will break fast or your head gets a strong injury, and then after it hunts its prey, it has its food. So its major things were major praise were the snakes. So it had a rapid delivering vertical downward strike with rigid skulls. The bite force was surprisingly weak. Why did it use its beak to, prick and take the prey away? Because it had a strong blow, but then its bite force was very low, proving that they were strikers. This provided that they were strikers and not grapplers. And the speed was very high. They were very good sprinters. and some species reached up to 50 km per hour, while the fastest species had up to 97 km per hour. So this is comparable to a modern cheetah if you're taking the contemporary perspective. So the extinction, why did this happen? Climate change. The first is that there was a lot of climate change, and this landscape altered the grasslands they relied on. These birds lived in the grasslands, so this changed the grasslands, and their specialized hunting style became very less effective. And the Great American Biotic Interchange. This is, see, while competition between mammals played a role, it wasn't immediate. The terror birds coexisted with the mammals for a long time. But when cheetahs, tigers, lions, all of it migrated from North America to South America, this grasslands became dominated with these large cats, and these terror birds had to go from the top predator to becoming a normal bird. It's still predated, but these cats became top predators, and their extinction was a result of cumulative pressures. It shrunk niches and it changed food web, proving even more successful predators are vulnerable to environmental shifts. You see, here you have to take a very, very important angle into account, that is the survival of fittest. You can take this concept in politics, organizations, economics. Only the fittest survives. So here, in the context of the same, when I talk about the survival of the fittest, talking about one important thing: the adaptability quotient. It should have high adaptability quotient, and only then can it survive. Any institution, any political organization, any economical institution, all of it survive because of the adaptability, and here also adaptability is very, very important. The next is the first species, Undagallinoris chuleti. It is 1.4 meters, and it is the focus of skull study, and we don't know the estimated speed, top speed. Next is the marshy species. It's mid-sized and it has 50 km per hour. This is the largest species. It has 97 km per hour. So we will see the diagrams of these birds, how they looked. So this is the first bird. The first bird that we saw with, we don't know what speed it had. This is the first bird. You see the large beak and the long toes. Here again, the second one, the marshy species, 50 km per hour. Sleek and slender legs, large beaks, body, and when you take the top part, disproportionately large sized head. And the last one is the Milne Dwarzi, again sleek and slender leg like our modern day chicken, but again disproportionately large head, and here you see its body. This is how it is, and the 97 km per hour species. Now we come to the prelims focus of the day. Consider the following statements regarding terror birds. They were apex predators of South America 60 million years ago. They are flightless birds, mostly use strike and retreat as their hunting strategy. They mostly inhabited the, it's not dense forest. You know that the answers are right only if grassland is present. So 3 is wrong. Only 2 statements should be right. Let's check. 2 only. So with this, we come to the end of the first topic of the day, and we are going to move to the second topic. So the next topic of the day that we are going to see about is in relation to dolphins and their evolution style. And recently, scientists have told that the dolphins may return as life on land, and the dolphins may come back to land. Is this possible? How much timeline would it take? And is it really a feasible thing that will happen? What does Dollo's law say on this? Is what this article is all about. The first slide, dolphins are fully aquatic mammals, and this is a new study which was published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society in 2026. This year, this study was published. It analyzed the evolutionary pathways of 5,600 plus mammal species, and the conclusion is that once mammals become fully marine, the reversal to land does not occur. But this does not mean that dolphins will never come back to land. Okay, which means that there is a evolutionary reversibility, but at present it is absent. So how will this happen is what we are going to see. Now see, there is a Dollo's law of irreversibility. It states that the complex traits once lost will not re-evolve. So the first slide is talking about the complex traits, but there are something like the simple traits. You might ask, what about the simple traits? So the simple traits are something that are likely to re-evolve. Fully aquatic mammals have lost terrestrial traits permanently, and they are supported by fossil evidence. They're supported by comparative anatomy, so they are compared with other anatomy of other mammals, and they are also having phylogenetic analysis. The additional fact is that Dollo's law is widely cited in evolutionary biology and paleontology. So basically, the most important thing is that simple traits might change, complex traits will not go back, and it cannot be reversed. That's Dollo's law, if you have to understand in a very, very simple perspective. Next, mammals to aquatic life, land to sea evolution. So a transition to water 50 to 60 million years ago, and not 250 million years ago, it predated mammals. So the examples of transitional forms are such, and modern dolphins belong to order Cetacea and family Delphinidae. So this is the family that they belong to, and these are the transitional forms. These are all very, very technical terms that you can see, but then you have to understand the concept. That the concept is where this is why the reversal is biologically impossible, is where the concept comes, because it already had the loss of limbs. That's why it went into the sea, and the limbs became flippers which helped it to swim. And again, the tail flukes that it had, they are for propulsion, they are for it to move forward, and the streamlined body and the thick coat that it has is for insulation from the cold waters. And now the specialized system is that it has a respiratory system of voluntary breathing, and it has a lot of reproductive adaptations. Earlier it was a mammal, it had a different kind of reproductive system when it was in land, and now it has aquatic birth, and there is a high metabolic demand in the carnivorous diet. So now you see that there are a lot of specialization anatomically that the dolphins have undergone. So these complex traits, according to Dollo's law, cannot be reversed. Okay. Next, specialization versus adaptability. Dolphins are apex predators. They are specialized marine organisms. They have lower ecological flexibility. They are vulnerable to ocean warming, acidification, prey depletion, pollution. These are vulnerability of those species. And specialized species are generally more vulnerable to environmental change. There are two types of species: generalist species and specialist species. And the specialist species are the ones which are more vulnerable to change. Now we have the prelims practice question for the day. Consider the following statements. Dolphins and orcas belong to the order Cetiae and are fully aquatic mammals. Dollo's law suggests that complex evolutionary traits once lost are unlikely to reappear in the same lineage. Right. Fully aquatic mammals have been observed to re-evolve terrestrial locomotion in recent geological time. No, it will take years even if that happens, and that also only when the simple traits that come back. So 3 is wrong. Whatever has 3 should go. So the answer should be 1 and 2. Let's check. Yes, the answer is 1 and 2 only. With this, we move to the third topic of the day. So, the next topic of the day that we are going to see is about the architectural styles, architectural heritage in the art and culture perspective. And the first that we are going to see is about the Taj Mahal, the Mughal perfection in white marble. Look at the picture. You see this picture, you see something that is very very pristine and pure. And here they used a optical illusion technique. What is that? When you stand far away from the Taj Mahal looks huge, it looks very big. But as you move closer and closer, Taj Mahal appears very small. This is an optical illusion technique that the constructed people have used to build this particular monument. Now let's see what the key facts are. It was built by Shah Jahan, completed in 1653 CE. This was the dynasty or the period. The architectural style is the Mughal architecture. It has Persian, Islamic, and Indian elements in it. The material is the Makarna marble, and the technique is Piyatar Dura. This technique is basically inlaying the stones within the monument. This is the style. The marble came from Rajasthan, the Makarna marble, which is very, very famous, very pristine marble. The main dome height is 73 meters. Now, what is this minaret tilt outward? So, here you see the dome. This dome is where you have the major attraction, and you have 4 minarets. Now, in case there is an earthquake, it will not fall towards the dome but outwards. So, you see that even in that point of time, the kings prioritized disaster based engineering style, and it had seismic sensitivity. So, earthquake safety, it's closed on Friday except for prayers. It was a World Heritage Site in 1983. This is all about the Taj Mahal. We're going to go to the second, that is Hampi. This particular place is a testament to the word lithic. It was built, the city was built with lithic. So the dynasty or the period is the Vijayanagara Empire, and the capital was it was a capital from 1336 to 1565 CE. The architectural style is the Vijayanagara style, and the key factors is the Virupaksha temple. Recently, last year in 2024 to 2025, at one particular point in time, this temple had a major fallout, and but its faith is from the 7th century CE. And there is also the Vitala temple, which has stone chariot and musical pillars, and it had hydraulic systems. So they had water management techniques. From a very early point in time, that is tanks, canals, and aqueducts. So this was a World Heritage Site in 1986. So this is Hampi. The next is about the Khajuraho temple. You see the Kandariya Mahadeva temple here, a beautiful architectural style. Now this was built by the Chandela dynasty, and this is in Nagara style. It has high shikaras, Amalaksha, Kalasha. We saw that it has a high shikara, it has a high Amalaksha, it has a high Kalasha. And the key fact is originally it had 85 temples, but only 25 survived. And the Kandariya Mahadeva temple is devoted to Lord Shiva, and it has erotic sculptures, and the others are only about 10% of carvings. But when you go to the Sanctum Sanctorum, there is no type of erotic carving. So, what did the builders have in mind is that when you have to go and get your moksha, when you go to see your Lord, you have to first face all the desires, all the erotic desires that you have, all the other worldly desires that you have are very, very common. You have to face that point in time, and only then can you go inside and face God, and you can get the divinity that is present in the sanctum sanctorum. The groups are Western group, that is main Hindu groups, Eastern groups, Hindu plus Jain groups, and the Southern group. This is about the Khajuraho temples in Madhya Pradesh. The next is about the Konark Sun Temple, also known as the Black Pagoda by travelers. You see this round that I am putting, the wheel, the spokes, it all has a significance. That is, it was built in the Eastern Ganga dynasty, built by Narasimha I in 13th century CE. The architectural style was a Kalinga style, and there was a Reka Pitta Dula, and the temple was built as Surya's chariot, which is why it has 24 spokes denoting the 24 hours. There is also one interesting story which is told. See, this is the temple where the linga floated earlier. Why did this happen? Because there was a strong magnetic realm that was there on the top. It was kept there, and which is why the linga kept floating. Now, this black pagoda, the name black pagoda came from travelers because the magnetic force so strong that the compass would show wrong direction. Usually when travelers had, they will have the north in the compass and they'll see, but this, because of this magnetic nature, it will keep fluctuating, and that's why this name came in, and it's very very significant. It has 24 wheels denoting 24 hours, and it has 7 horses. The wheels act as the sundials, and it is made of condylite stone, and the main sanctum collapsed during invasion when the magnet was taken, and the main sanctum was disbarred, and the linga was disrespected at that point in time. It became a World Heritage Site in 1984. And the next is about the Hava Mahal. All of these are windows. You see micro engineering technique here. I'm giving you all these terms so that you can use it in the answers when you compare your past and your present. So, this is micro engineering technique. How is that? I'll tell you. The dynasty is by the Kachwaha Rajput dynasty. It was built by Savai Pratap Singh, and it is a Rajput architecture, but it has a lot of Mughal influence in it. There are about 953 Jarokas. Jarokas are basically these window like panes. So they allowed in these windows, these women used to stand and they used to observe street street life. They used to observe that. But why did I say it's a micro engineering technique? Because it is in a honeycomb like structure. If you see, it's in a honeycomb like structure which allowed air to pass in, and it became a very cooling factor. So the Hava Mahal is very very significant, and it is built with red and pink sandstone, and it's a natural ventilation system as already stated. The next is the Mysore Palace. It is by the Udayar dynasty. The present structure was completed in 1912. It has a lot of influences: Hindu, Islamic, Gothic, and Rajput architecture. The architect was Henry Irwin. It was used for Dasara celebrations, and there are a lot of mythical stories that revolve around the Mysore Palace. It was electrically illuminated with 97,000 bulbs, and it replaced earlier wooden palace that was burnt in 1897. The first Mysore Palace was a wooden one, and then later this became the structure. Even the Somnath temple, we saw that before the reign of Kumarapala, it was a wooden structure, and only then the structure was changed. So even here it was a wooden palace, and only then it was changed into a stone building. The next one is the Red Fort, which is of big significance. Again, this was built by Shah Jahan during the Mughal Empire. It was a military and administrative unit, a block there. It is of red sandstone. Structures are Diwani Yam and Diwani Khas. The British modifications happened post 1857, and every year during the Independence Day, our Prime Minister addresses from the Red Fort, and it is a World Heritage Site in 2007. Next is the Gold Gumbaz. The Gold Gumbaz is from the Adil Shahi dynasty, completed in 1656 CE, and the architectural style is a Deccan Islamic architectural style. It is the diameter is 44 meter. It is a mausoleum of Muhammad Adil Shah, and it's the second largest pre-modern dome after the Pantheon. It has no supporting pillars at all, and is famous for the Whispering Gallery. Now, the Whispering Gallery also can be termed as a surveillance system. Why is it a surveillance system? Because when we stand at one point and the Sultan claps, it would be heard with so much precision. That is, if somebody is talking something, from where the Sultan is sitting, he will be able to hear everything that happens, every sound. That's why the Whispering Gallery in Gold Gumbaz is very, very famous. Okay, this we have already seen. Now we have come to the prelims practice question of the day. With reference to Indian architecture, consider the following statements. The Konark Sun Temple is built in the Nagara style and uses Kondalit stone. Gold Gumbaz is the largest, no? It's the second largest after Pantheon in the world. Pitra Dura technique is prominently seen in Mughal monuments such as the Taj Mahal. Yes. So 2 is wrong. 2 should not come. So the answer should be 1 and 3 only. Let's check. Yes, the answer is 1 and 3 only. With this, we come to the end of this topic. So we are moving into the main topic of the day, and the main topic of the day is in regard to the art and culture perspective. And the article was written by Devdutt Patnaik, one of the most famous historians, and he has a lot of cultural angles that he can contribute to in the UPSC perspective. And now we are going to see about the Shishupalgarh. This is the forgotten capital of ancient Kalinga. So now he gives one important line that you can use in any essay perspective or even as an opening line for your GS1 answers. That is, the name reflects a dialogue between archaeology and imagination. That is, archaeology, he says, speaks to stones. Here you see the stone pillars. He is mentioning that the stones, and imagination speaks to stories. So he is talking about this urban world which spoke through stories, and the urban world which had a lot of imagination and testaments of time. So now why Shishupalgarh matters? See, this is an ancient fortified city. The fortified city is near modern Bhubaneswar, Odisha. Now if you take this fortified city, it is in the form of a Gadakal, meaning it is surrounded by water. This whole city was fortified in a way that it was surrounded by water. The next, it was a part of the ancient Kalinga region. It flourished around 2000 years ago. It represents early Indian urbanization outside the Gangetic core. So usually it was near the Gangetic region. Now this is outside the Gangetic core. So this shows secondary urbanization. This shows secondary urbanization. It lacks major religious monuments. See, whenever there are a lot of religious monuments, because we want to conserve that particular site or we have a lot of faith and belief, we go there and we understand that this is how things are. And because of the faith, it keeps following and it is withstood the testaments of time. Like recently we saw the example of the Somnath temple, which had so much of invasions, destruction, reconstruction, but because of the faith, it was there. Now, when we say about the Shishupalgarh, it does not have any religious monuments, and henceforth, historically, it is very, very under-recognized. The next is about the chronology and the political context. See, in the age of empires, it's a very, very important city. It was around the 3rd century BCE, and this was constructed post Ashoka's Kalinga War. Now, the peak was from 1st century BCE to 3rd century BCE. Now, I'll tell you, in Arthashastra of Kautilya, he talks about a Sastra pattern. What is a Sastra pattern? He talks about a square grid-like structure. Okay. So he talks about a square grid-like structure, and this entire city is planned in such a way that it is 1.2 kilometers into 1.2 kilometers exactly, surrounded by water. Henceforth, this is called as a iron cage pattern. So where can we use this? We can use this when we are writing a parallel with Indus Valley civilization, and we can talk about the first urbanism also had a grid-like pattern, the second urbanism also had a grid-like pattern, and in the present day convergence and in the present day context, Chandigarh is one such place. Okay. Next, it was a contemporary with the Satavahanas in Deccan, the Kushanas in the North India, the Indo-Greeks, Sakas and Parthians. So, in this period, we had a lot of state systems that were expanding, and the monetization was present, and there was long distance trade. We also have evidences of trade with the Roman Empire with the roulette pottery. Next, urban planning and architecture, evidence of advanced urbanism. There is a massive laterite fortification and cardinal directions. What are cardinal directions? North, south, west, and east. You have laterite formation aligned with the cardinal directions. And the next is the planned features that we see. Streets and drainage is the first one. We saw that it had proper grid-like streets, and the drainage pattern also was very neat and covered. The residential zones were present, and the monumental gateways. What are monumental gateways? Separate entrance and exit. The 16 pillars, these are stone pillars, they are still present. The stone pillars are called Sola Kamba. The Sola Kamba is a stone pillar, and the remains of these stone pillars are the remains of an elevated hall. So this elevated hall might be used for some civic function or some administrative function. Here you can also take the example of Archaeological Monument and Ancient Sites Remains Act. Why? Because this particular place where the Sola Kamba is present, there are illegal occupancy of land. So you can give in a governance angle to this art and culture perspective. Next, moving on, the trade networks and global connections. In the early globalization, see the Odisha coast integrated to the Indian Ocean region, and henceforth the archaeological evidence shows that was linked to Roman trade, as already stated, the roulette pottery, and there were also beads of semi-precious stones that were present. So here, L. Dahl, the person who was present in the excavation of Hastinapur plus Indus Valley civilization, is the one who is present in the excavation of this particular Shishupalgarh as well. And it is connected to the Gangetic Plain, the Deccan, Southeast Asia and Mediterranean world. So it was a well connected governance. Yes. Next, faith before formalization. We already knew that there are no dominant religious movements, no dominant religious patterns present here, but the terracotta figures show village goddesses that were present, the yaksha and the tree cults and early Durga forms. the Buddhist influence is that it is in proximity to two regions that are very, very important in the art and culture perspective. One is Dauli and the other one is Jaugada. And we also see that there is a early Shaivite and Vaishnavite presence in this region. So religion was, you cannot say that religion was not present at all. There were no religious monuments, but religion was present and was fluid. So at one point you will have Buddhism, the next point you will have Hinduism. In Hinduism you will have Vaishnavism, and you will also have Shaivism. So you had a overlapping religion context, and sectarian identities were not yet rigid. So a lot of people kept overlapping. It was not a rigid thing. The next one, the original name is unknown. The modern name is Shishupalgar. It is derived from Mahabharata Shishupala. We also know that this is a very, very common story wherein Krishna gave so many warnings. 100 times he warned and he left Shishupala whenever he insulted Lord Krishna. But then after the 100th time, he was killed by Lord Krishna himself, and this came from a curse, and how 100 times he gave in because the mother of Shishupala requested Lord Krishna. So this is a story that was derived. So from there we get the name Shishupalkar. The original name is you don't have any concrete evidence, but then in the Hattikumpur inscription, it was mentioned Kalinagara. So they think that this Shishupalgar's name and Kalinagara are the same thing. Just like how we know that Devanampiya Piyadasi is Ashoka and they are both the same, or Sandrakotas is Chandragupta Maurya, they think that Kalinagara is Shishupalgar. And this is why we have a lot of folk explanation of the ruins. So we also have a mythical angle. You remember in the first slide we spoke about how stone pillars have some reality in them, and also imagination gives us a lot of stories. Here the story reconnects because there are a lot of folk explanations. Scholars also suggest that the possible ancient name is Kalinagara, but it's not conclusively proven. It is taken from this particular inscription. The next, the decline is in 4th century CE because the river course shifted. You see that even in the present day context, there are a lot of river courses that shift, and it causes a lot of meandering. So this was one of the reasons, and trade routes changed and political reorientation kept happening again and again. Henceforth, it was gradual abandonment. It was not a sudden collapse. And in today, we see that this is one of the earliest planned cities in India. It underwent the second urbanization, and it had a lot of things to provide to the world. And the first urbanization, as we already know in India, is the Indus Valley civilization. And this is one of Odisha's greatest centrality. So when we come to the mains practice question, Shishupalgar illustrates both early sophistication of Indian rural urban planning and India's integration into wider Asian and Mediterranean networks. Discuss the context in early historical period. Here, when you write in the first slide, you will write about Indian planning and the drainage system, the grid-like planning, the Shastra system. You will write all that. The first page after the introduction, when you give 5 to 6 points, it will be done. And when you're writing about the Asian and Mediterranean networks, you'll talk about the global context in the middle of the second page, and you will write about the pottery, the precious metals, the trade routes, how it was linked to the Indian Ocean. You will write about all that, and that will be done. And then you can give a small map diagram in the left of the page or the right of the page, and you can give a conclusion. But with this, there's also one important thing that you have to connect, that is the Pataliputra versus Shishupalgar. This is not in relation to the question. I repeat, this is not in relation to the question, but it is always good for you to have a comparison between these two states, so that you will have a even more brief understanding of what things are. So with this, we move to the prelims focus for the day. So the prelims focus of the day, we have three very factual articles. The first is the Zero Fatalities program. The lead entities are from the Ministry of Transport and Highways and Save Life Foundation. There are two integrated units here. The scope is that 100 districts across 15 states, Uttar Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, Karnataka. The rationale is that 63% of road fatalities occur on roads which are not highways. So they are aiming to reduce these road-based fatalities, and the focus is on road design, enforcement, and hospital preparedness. And there are 89,000 deaths recorded and 17,331 critical crash locations identified. The crash profiles are from rear end collisions and head on collisions and pedestrian incidents. So, with this, there is a strategic framework. They want to conduct engineering audits first, and they want to deploy low cost safety interventions too, and improve trauma care, that is, the ambulance response and the training for that. They want to improve that. Then the governance angle, the committees which shall be led by district collectors and transport ministers and MPs. The UN General Assembly resolution shows that 74 out of 299 declared a decade of action in road safety with a target to reduce road traffic death and injuries by at least 50% during this period. So this is something we have to remember. Next is about the comprehensive health pavilion. It's in the Gujarat Regional Exhibition of 2026. It's established by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. This theme is Swasthya Bharat, Shrestha Bharat. That is, they want to promote the preventive healthcare mechanisms and enhance our awareness about various governmental health programs, and they are encouraging active community engagement. The significance is that it reflects the Government of India's commitment and strengthen the public health systems and fostering healthy, empowered and resilient society. And the next is the Uttar Pradesh Regional AI Impact Conference. Is that it's organized across the country. It's hosted by India AI and the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology with the government of Uttar Pradesh. This demonstrates how the real world deployment of AI is present across health systems, digital public infrastructure and state-led use cases, and they're also fostering a collaboration between the governments, the academia, the startups and the industries in India's framework. With this, we are moving into the practice question. Which one of the following ministry has launched the Zero Fatality program? It's not Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, not Tribal Affairs, it's Road Transport and Highways. So the answer should be option C. Let's check. Yes, the answer is Ministry of Road Transport and Highways. So option C. With this, we come to the end of today's video. Please send across your suggestions in the comment box given below if you have any with regard to the video, teaching or anything additional that you need. Thank you. Please like, comment and share and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and also hit the bell icon if you want to receive instant updates. We hope you like the video today. Thank you for watching.